We're now continuing our study in the Westminster Larger Catechism. This section we have designated the Doctrine of God, or Theology Proper. This is question number 7, part 2, installment number 4 in this section. Question 7, the divines ask, what is God? They answered, quote, God is a spirit, in and of himself, infinite in being, glory, blessedness, and perfection, all-sufficient, eternal, unchangeable, incomprehensible, everywhere present, almighty, knowing all things, most wise, most holy, most just, most merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in goodness and truth. The Westminster Divines in question 7 now directs our attention to the question which we have stated clearly in our whole section of the doctrine of Scripture be answered only from the Holy Scripture. And the question they asked was, what is God? Now, if you remember, the divines began their answer with this statement, God is a spirit. And we noted in John 4:24, here Jesus says, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. This first answer is relevant to the rest of the answer to question number 7. Next, the divines continue their definition of God by stating that God is, note the phrasing, in and of himself, infinite in being, glory, blessedness, and perfection. By the term infinite, the divines mean that God is without limits. He's boundless. In other words, God cannot be measured by finite man. There is nothing that you can image of God, of the triune God, the God who is spirit, because he is invisible to us. He is boundless. Any imaging, which is why it's forbidden, as we had noted in the commandment that says, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, is because once you try to image that God, you have bound him. Thus, when we say that God is free from all limitations, we must remember that the first statement of this question really maintains our principle. God is a spirit. That is to say, God is pure spirit. Therefore, he does not have a body or parts like unto man, or anything that he created. And he is the creator of everything that exists, whether it be spiritual, distinct from him and his being as spirit, spiritual meaning angels or the soul of men, or the estate wherein now Christ dwells in bodily form in the resurrected body. Someday we too, when we pass from this life, will also go to be there. That realm and the temporal realm are all created by God. His existence, we say, theologically, is simplicity. It is that of pure spirit. This is often defined in systematic theology as being one of the incommunicable attributes of God, which man cannot possess, or better stated, he does not reflect this attribute in his being, as some of the attributes we do that are communicable, we reflect in our own nature. This is, of course, confusing to some, but the principle is quite simple. God exists as an infinite being, as pure spirit, and therefore to seek to define God beyond the propositions of Holy Scripture as they define him is to circumscribe the very nature of his being, imposing limitations upon him. God is, spirit. And God exists as spirit. He's not in a state of becoming. He is not changing. He cannot be defined in terms that impose limitations upon his being. God does not have definitive limitations that can be comprehended by finite man. For if man could understand the being of God beyond the propositional statements in the Scripture, defining him as an infinite spirit, it would mean that we also would have to be infinite in our understanding, and therefore in our being, that is, in our existence. We would therefore be co-equal and existent with God. That simply cannot be. The divines maintain in this section of the larger catechism that we can only receive the self-revelation of God wherein he is properly understood, though with limitations because of our finite ability in knowledge. We can therefore say God is known only by the propositions of Holy Scripture, and we are limited to such a knowledge from that source alone. That source that we call the axiom of Christianity. Exodus 3:14 says, "And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you." He is identified by name in his propositions, but he is never described apart from being spirit. And therefore, we can say that he is pure spirit, that he is the only being like unto himself, because we have that defined for us in Scripture. But beyond that, we speak to him in relationship to the three persons of the Godhead, which more identifies the Father, the Son, and the Spirit to us. But as to the triune God, or what we call the Godhead, he says, I am who I am. Job 11:7-9 says, "Can you search out the deep things of God? Can you find out the limits of the Almighty? They are higher than heaven. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol. What can you know? Their measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea." Therefore, God is defined as to his being, that is, to his existence, in four ways here by the Westminster Divines. They say that he is infinite. Secondly, he is expressed as to his glory. Third, blessedness. And fourth, perfection. It should also be noted that the boundlessness of God is not to be understood by a concept of boundless extension, meaning that in one part of a particular place we find one aspect of God, and yet in another we find a different aspect of the same God. God is uncontained and the boundless one. He exists, and everything else is created. In that way, we say theologically, God transcends his creation. Well, by this we mean that God, as pure spirit, and all things have their existence, we are told in Scripture, by him and in him, but not as a part of his being. That would be pantheism. Nor is he limited by any aspect of his creation. Therefore, we say he transcends it. Listen, if you will, to the testimony of the Apostle Paul in Colossians 1:17. And he, here is a reference to Christ, who is the Godhead bodily, and he is before all things, and in him all things consist. Acts 17, Paul, at Mars Hill, speaking to the pagan Greeks, says, beginning at verse 26, and he, this God, it is the unknown God, he says, I'm defining for you who he is, and he, God, has made from one blood every nation of men, to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As also some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Here Paul quoting the pagan poet saying, we are the creation of God. We are, in that sense, his offspring. Well, clearly, God exists. And before creation was brought into existence, all that was God. That's what we mean by God is pure spirit. He is not stretched throughout the universe. The universe, all things created, whether they be the spirit realm, of which we spoke of earlier, heaven, that realm of angelic dwelling, where Christ now is, where our souls go when they depart, or the temporal realm, time and space. They all have come into existence because God has thought them into existence. And while they are not a part of him, they dwell in him as his thoughts, his word. That's why in him we move and have our being, and in him all things consist. All things were created by him and for him. And unto him, therefore, the creature is to give all glory and honor to this God, of which no other God is defined like unto this God, Creator, Redeemer, as he is revealed in the Scripture to us, so that we may acknowledge and worship him properly.